Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy for the COVID-19 economy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, Senior Fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. Our guest today is Irena Asmundson, Chief Economist for the California Department of Finance. Dr. Asmundson previously was a senior economist at the International Monetary Fund and staff economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. She has a PhD in economics from Stanford University and bachelor's degrees in mathematics and economics from MIT. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please identify yourself and your organization. The event's being recorded and will be posted shortly on TPC's website. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Irena Asmundson, welcome to The Prescription.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to be with you. So I can't imagine a more difficult time to do economic forecasting than today, especially in California. Besides the usual uncertainties, you've had to deal with COVID-19 and in recent weeks, historic wildfires. Give us a sense of what a day is like for you and your staff. How are you managing this?
Well, every day is different, which is one of the things that I love. Clearly a lot has happened. Wildfires are happening right now. Our air quality has been terrible. It's becoming ever more apparent that climate change is here right now. We can't really put it off anymore. The COVID pandemic was really a historic thing. Sorry. But we talk a lot about how in California, even though the size of the pandemic was really unprecedented and the pandemic itself was a surprise, it really just exposed and accelerated some of the trends that were underlying. We already had problems with the cost of living in California. We already had problems with inequality, both in California and all over the United States. We're facing lots of problems with an aging population and other things. So in that sense, it's the same thing. It's just a little bit more acute right now.
So how have the challenges affected your ability to project California's economy in both the short and the medium term? It must have created a lot of uncertainty. How has it affected your ability to actually do your job?
There has been a great deal of uncertainty. I am very fortunate in having a wonderful team who is ready and willing and right now is digging into all of the details of what we've been observing. One of the hardest things for forecasters right now is that it's been so unprecedented. The size of the shocks and also the mechanisms of how the economy is working are working in a different way than they have before. And so certain things that we sort of took for granted before, for example, that people would be on unemployment for a while and then they would be able to quickly return to work. That's probably going to be different in the future. And so just like with every forecast, we know we're going to be wrong. What's important for us is sort of talking about what the underlying mechanisms are and to help people understand how to interpret things and also how to do a better job of serving the people.
So that raises an interesting question. So I know that policymakers love to have point estimates for things. How do you alert them to the inherent uncertainties of forecasting in this environment?
That's a great question. So for the last couple of years, we have had a baseline forecast. When I look at my January forecast, I have to laugh a little bit because we had assumed that out of all historical record, we would sort of maintain ourselves at this very low rate of unemployment. So in our baseline forecast, we sort of have to assume that conditions will continue and that a recovery will continue. And so we had assumed that we were going to be about 4% unemployment for California going forward. If you look at our charts, that looks unprecedented, and clearly that was unprecedented. So we do a baseline forecast, and then we also what we call stress tests. During good times, that will be a recession scenario. In our May revision, we published both a baseline scenario that showed a fairly quick recovery, what we thought, and also an extended disruption forecast, where we thought that the pandemic would last a little bit longer, the disruption to the economy would be a little bit bigger, just to give policymakers a sense of how things could go wrong.
Okay, and I hope they took that seriously, because I guess the tendency is, I just want to listen to the good news. I don't even want to read the potential bad news.
But they do the budget on the basis of the baseline, but the extended disruption scenario does influence how they think about risks.
Good. So let's get a little more specific. So California suffered more than 700,000 cases of COVID-19 and nearly 15,000 deaths. So how specifically has it changed your forecast?
So one thing that I do want to make sure everyone understands is that there is no trade-off between the economy and public health. You need the public health situation to improve to have a viable economy. And so in California, we're very much focused on getting infections under control, making sure that we are able to protect our people. And then once we have that under control, then we should be able to allow people to return to more normal patterns of economic activity. They should be able to go out a little bit more. One of the things that has been observed is that a great deal of economic activity actually can happen with social distancing. A lot of people can work very effectively from home. A great deal of our GDP and our income actually comes from people who can work from home. And so you see these huge unemployment numbers. In terms of the overall impact, it's been not as bad as I had thought.
I want to ask you about that. So you mentioned your January forecast, and then you did a revision in May. And in that revision, you projected the economy would bottom out in the second quarter with a slow recovery after that. Nationally, the economy's bounced back more quickly than many expected, though it's obviously got a long way to go before it returns to pre-pandemic levels. Give our audience who are not going to be familiar with California a sense of the pattern of economic change in California through March until now.
Sure. So this has been difficult to explain. So usually we look at unemployment rates as an indicator of the health of the economy. And in our forecast in May, we had said we think that we are going to rise to about 25% unemployment in California. And then we're going to come back down fairly quickly as the pandemic comes under control. So we actually, it looks like we topped out at 16.4% unemployment in California. However, we did not account for the number of people who would not be counted as part of the labor force. So to be part of the labor force and to be counted as unemployed, you have to be actively looking for work. There were a lot of people who, for childcare reasons, for health reasons, were not actively looking for work. And there was this enormous drop in the labor force. And that's why the actual measured unemployment rate was lower than what we had thought. If you look at the number of people who are receiving some form of unemployment insurance in California compared to the 19.5 million people in California who were in the labor force in February, 25% or more of those are now receiving some form of unemployment insurance. And so that's becoming our preferred measure of how to see how disrupted the economy has been. And in the rest of the US, people have gone back to work a little bit sooner. I worry a little bit about the public health implications of that in other states, but other states have done different things. And so what we've been trying to do is compare everything to the February levels. And there, the measured rate of who is out of a job is much higher than the measured rates of unemployment.
And what's the pattern you've seen in recent weeks, let's say? The national numbers, we just saw, new numbers this morning, seem to have plateaued in terms of jobs. What are you seeing out there? Is that situation happen with you as well, or what's happening?
This is a great observation, and it's interesting to see hedonic adaptation, which is the technical term of you get used to stuff. Hedonic adaptation in economist forecasts. So, we had over 800,000 people file new claims for unemployment insurance. That's what was just announced this morning for the US. That is still, I think, almost 200,000 more people than during the peak of the Great Recession. And that's come down markedly, which is why we're like, oh, great, it's only about 800,000. That's an enormous amount of people. That's a lot of people who just lost their jobs or who are just now being able to file for unemployment insurance. And so, yes, it's getting better, but it's still historically terrible.
So that's all about COVID and the pandemic. And then just on top of that, just to make things even more interesting, you've had these horrible wildfires for the last month or so. Give us a sense about the effect on the economy of the fires.
So during my time in California, we have dealt with a number of natural disasters. When I first started, we were in the middle of a historic drought. We've had wildfire season. There is a fire season in California now. There have been floods in the past. There's all sorts of natural disasters that do happen in California, as there are in other states as well. We don't have tornadoes, for example. And so it's terrible. The entire state is pretty much blanketed by smoke. However, as I said before, a great deal of our economic activity is actually able to be done from home. And so it is terrible if you are a farm worker and you're out in the fields and you are picking our food. And that is very difficult to deal with. It's very difficult to deal with if you are a construction worker and you're trying to build housing, because California has a historic lack of housing. But in terms of GDP, it's not going to be so bad. And because a lot of this can shift both in time, you can compress activity and you can just do work from home.
Have you seen any regional variation as a result of the fires?
We're still unpacking that. Certainly the places that have been on fire, they're going to be much more affected.
And that's what, San Diego, LA, and I guess north of San Francisco, right?
And also in some of the more rural areas. California is this extraordinarily diverse state. And so we have places like LA, we have places like San Diego or the Bay Area, but we also have tiny little towns that are much more similar to, the middle of Illinois, for example, than to the Bay Area.
Sure. Give us a sense of the effect of all this specific on revenues and the budget. We've talked about the economy generally, but I know that this has had the COVID first has had a profound effect on state revenues. My understanding is the March to July period, state revenues are off more than 10% from the same period in 2019. Have you begun to see any recovery from that decline?
It's a great question. So for context, California's general fund revenues is somewhere on the order of 150 billion. So I know that for other states, that's an enormous amount. We are the largest state. And in the run-up to the May revision, we were talking about, hey, we think that we're going to be facing a deficit of about 54 billion. That's both from loss of revenues and also from the increase in our entitlement programs, such as Medi-Cal, which is what we call Medicaid in California, and other assistance programs that sort of are natural stabilizers. So we did close that gap through a combination of using our rainy day funds. California, in the recovery from the last recession, put huge efforts into building up those rainy day funds. And so, we had on the order of $15 to $20 billion that we could use over a couple of years to buffer it and give ourselves some time to make cuts and do adjustments. Without that, it would have been much more dire. I will also say, as we've disclosed in our monthly updates, revenues have been coming in a little bit stronger than what we had thought. And so we are seeing something of a recovery. This also reinforces, however, that a lot of our revenues are coming from the wealthier individuals in California. And because they have been able to stay at work, because they've been able to continue to be productive, even during social distancing, revenues might not be as bad as what we had thought.
And this is mostly the unexpected strength is mostly in income taxes or sales taxes, or where are you seeing it?
Um, it's both sales taxes and in personal income taxes. Yeah.
Mhm. And what about corporate? Were you seeing much surprise there?
Corporate taxes are down a little bit, I think, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, but they're coming in pretty close to what we had forecast in the May revision.
Hmm. Hmm. So you mentioned already the issue of the state tapping its reserves. Many states, of course, have done that. My understanding is California, in some ways, you're required to do that. But give us a sense of what your thinking is behind tapping reserves rather than cutting spending.
So a lot of the safety net happens through state and local governments. So, you know, we have talked to the federal government about how we don't want to work at cross purposes with the federal government. The federal government is trying to stimulate the economy. They have the firepower to do that. They don't have a prohibition on running deficits. They don't have to balance their budget every single year. And so to us, the best that we can do is not to lean too much against that. It's not to try and undermine that too much. And if we were to cut spending, then we would be undermining all of those federal efforts. And a lot of the mechanisms of helping people do flow from federal funding through the state and local budgets to people. And so if we want to get through this pandemic with a functioning economy and people who aren't destitute, then we do need to allow those mechanisms to keep going. That's why we spent so much time and effort building up our reserves so that we wouldn't have to unexpectedly cut state spending and, deliver a second blow when the economy is terrible.
So I think about a program like Medicaid. Have you seen a big increase in Medicaid spending as a result of people losing their jobs and seeing declines in income?
We have seen an increase in enrollment. It has not been as large as what we had thought, which could be people are on COBRA or they're able to make it work or they went to the ACA. We did open up our enrollment, which I think was a very good thing. But it could also be that California already had, I think, around a third of our population that was already on Medicaid. So California is very committed to making sure that people have access to health insurance. And so we do have a program that helps people get health insurance and stay on health insurance.
So the governor proposed significant spending reductions, but they were based on a series of triggers based on the amount of money that the federal assistance the state would receive. It's beginning to look like Congress won't approve any kind of stimulus bill until at least November, and state and local aid is even more uncertain. So how's that going to affect California's spending plans? You've dipped into the reserve, into the rainy day fund. What happens now if that money doesn't arrive?
So the way the budget structure was done was we adopted a budget that said we are going to undertake these spending plans. And then the trigger was for if we receive additional funding, then we are going to spend an additional amount on these things. So it was sort of a contingency budget. If those contingencies don't happen, then everything continues as we had planned. We don't get that extra boost. It would be really good to get that federal assistance. We would be able to spend more on education. We would be able to help more people. Locals would probably not have to undertake the same cuts that they're undertaking now, but there are no actions needed once that money doesn't come in.
Can you give us a sense, maybe quantify a little bit, what would happen, for example, to state spending for, say, education, if that money, what is happening if that money doesn't come in?
Oh, that's a sort of complicated situation. California has this sort of automatic system, which is called the Prop 98 system of allocating a certain amount of general fund to educational spending. And then that's also, there's local matches and it gets a little complicated. But basically, if we were to get at least $14 billion in direct federal assistance to our budget, then we would be able to unlock an additional $11 billion of state spending. Some of that would go to education, some of that would go to other programs, and that's contained in our budget.
Mhm. You've talked, I know, a lot about the effects of Black Lives Matter movement and some of the issues that that has uncovered. Give us a sense of how that's playing out in California and kind of the importance of those issues.
Yeah, so I mentioned that this pandemic has really exposed, exacerbated, accelerated some of the underlying systemic issues that we were facing in California and that we face in the US as a whole. And unfortunately, there really is systemic racism. There really is systemic sexism. Economists like to think that we're this completely rational species and that we just do things on the basis of profitability, but people are biased. Until we recognize that, until we actively lean against it, it's going to be there and it's going to lead to inefficiencies in our system. So I talk a lot to people who don't normally think about budgets because they're scared of the math, that budgets are an expression of our values. And so if we have set up a system of how we tax and how we spend that leads to these systemically racist outcomes, what does that say about our values? And once we recognize that, then how do we do a better job?
So be more specific. Give me an example of a program that the state is not spending sufficiently on, or a program where the state is spending too much, where these assets are being misallocated in some way.
Well, let me point to two good examples. One was our deep commitment to health insurance. Health outcomes for people of color, health outcomes for poor people, there's a disparity. And by some measures, I've been told that there are fewer disparities in California than there are in other places because we do have this very robust safety net with regards to healthcare access. So that's a great thing. A couple of years ago, we also recognized that the bail system and how the bail system is run in California does lead to these disparate impacts. And so now there is a process in place done through the courts where they are now supposed to talk about what can you afford in terms of bail, so that you don't get this situation where someone gets arrested, they can't make bail, and then their entire life just falls apart. They could be completely innocent, but that one arrest just unwinds everything because they're stuck in jail, they can't go to their job, they can't pay their bills, they lose their house, they lose their car, then they can't get to another job. It just, we should not be doing this. And so those are two things that I would point to that sort of recognize this and lean against it.
So as usual, California voters will weigh in on a number of important ballot measures in November, including key initiatives on property taxes and the definition of independent contractors, which will affect taxes paid by gig workers and others. How are these initiatives going to affect California's economy?
So let me talk about the gig workers and the independent contractors first. Our entire economy is based on the idea that people can get a living wage and through employment can support themselves. And so independent contractors have existed for a long time. Independent contractors should probably always exist because some people have more bargaining power than others. The part where it gets a little bit tricky is if someone doesn't have bargaining power. And so AB 5, which was our Assembly Bill 5, and some of the court cases have recognized that in certain situations, workers should be protected more and should not be treated as independent contractors because they don't have the agency in that employment situation to effectively bargain for themselves, and they could be exploited. So it's a balancing act. We don't want all independent contractors to go away. For example, high-end architects or high-end economic consultants should be independent contractors, but that's because they have agency, they have a bargaining power. I'm sorry, what was the other proposition that you wanted?
Before we get to the other one, I want to just follow up on this one. So there are tax issues, though, that are related to this. This is not just about employment security and that sort of thing. And of course, you've had Uber and Lyft basically saying, we're out of here if we're required to deal with some of these tax issues. So what's your sense of this? Is Is this an empty threat, or are you taking this seriously?
I would also like to point out that Uber and Lyft, I don't think are profitable yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know that we collect any taxes from them.
But they would have to collect payroll taxes, presumably, for their employees, their workers. I have to be careful here.
And so, well, we consider them to be employees.
Yeah.
Legally, they are supposed to be considered employees. And those workers did not receive the employee benefits that they were supposed to because they were treated as independent contractors. And so, you know, the federal government did bail them out essentially by offering this pandemic unemployment assistance, which is available to independent contractors. But the way the system is supposed to work is that they are supposed to receive these benefits, and there is supposed to be this tax revenue that goes into the unemployment insurance system.
So the other initiative I wanted to ask you about is the property tax issue. That was the second one. Same question: is that going to have much effect on the state's economy?
So
And your budget?
Love property taxes because it's one of those ones where it's very location based. You can't evade it, and it also helps to sort of intermediate between supply and demand in a way that is very tied to the public good of where people are located. And so the governor has publicly said that he supports the passage of this proposition. It would give more funding to the state. I worry a little bit about the discouraging impact on businesses, and I worry about the incentives for locals to zone for business rather than housing. Since we have such but the governor has said that he thinks that it's a good idea.
So more broadly, California's got a long history with ballot initiatives, going back to Prop 13, 40 years ago. They've had major fiscal implications, Prop 13 particularly. And I wonder, how do you think the widespread use of voter initiatives affects the state's ability to manage its budget? It must add to your challenge.
When I was in graduate school, we talked a lot about which system is better. Is a parliamentary system better, or is like a presidential system better? And my conclusion from all of this is that it doesn't really matter what kind of system you have. Doesn't matter if you have propositions, you don't have propositions. What matters is policymakers sort of understanding public goods and making wise choices to help people survive in an economy and to help intermediate between the differing interests. And we're always learning more about how that's playing out, and we're always going to have to do adjustments in the future. So propositions or not, what matters is, are we serving the people, and do we have a healthy economy?
We have just about a minute left, so let me ask you one last question. With all of these challenges, we talked about COVID, we've talked about racial issues, talked about the fires. Which is the one that keeps you up most at night?
Climate change. We cannot survive. We can't plan for the future. We can't have health if we don't address climate change. And one of the things that happened at the beginning of the pandemic was that everyone all of a sudden overnight changed their lifestyle. And that kind of gave me some hope that maybe it's not so difficult to change our lives so that we can lead a net zero carbon lifestyle. It's going to be really difficult. It's going to take a lot of effort, but we can do it, and we have to do it.
An interesting issue, especially in California, with more people working at home. Will that, in the long term, mean more people out of their cars, and will that have some positive effect? Interesting to see.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time. Irena Asmundson, thank you very much for taking time with us. I know you're very busy. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and good luck.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.